Okay, here we go with part 4. Before we really get started, part 4, by the way, is on page 23. We're going to be editing the CSS in just a moment, and this would be a good time for me to finally fix that mistake I made really early on, change the name of this to actually spell it correctly. So I click on here and just wait for a moment. I get that rename function, and I can put an E in there. And then when I click off, see what happens? Update the links. I say update, and look what's happened. The name has changed here, and in the link, the name is changed also. So that's one of the benefits of this new site definition, is it keeps track of the name and it makes sure it's the right name, so the link's always going to work, and so on. Same thing would happen if I changed the name of, for instance, our page, our sites page, which is in our navigation. It would update the link in the navigation and stuff like that. Okay, part 4 talks about what the page should look like. We just did that last time. And just to remind you, at this point, it looks something like this. Okay. And then on page 24, there's a discussion about, it says simplify width and height calculations. You'll remember this from our box model talk. I do want you to read through that paragraph. What it comes down to is, how do we measure the width of a box? Which method are we going to use? The default content method or the border box method? And in this tutorial, we're going to use the border box method, which we really haven't really used much at all, except just in a little demo, right? So it's easier to do this, to do this little bit of change here, just so we can experience it more. And it's going to be easier to type it directly into the CSS, which we haven't done yet either. So here I am. I want to get to the CSS itself, and I click on responsive. It brings up the CSS, which so far has really nothing in it, right? Except for the wrapper. Okay. In the code, create a blank line on line 2, it says. So we're going to write something right at the very top. And frankly, blank lines don't really matter, but I'll just go to the top of it. First, we're going to write a comment. Now remember, this is a CSS comment. The only thing that you might see is a little different than when we did our CSS page. This has a care set at the top of it. Not really necessary, but it's fine. It doesn't hurt anything. You also notice, though, that there is no HTML anywhere, and that's correct. There's not supposed to be any HTML in this page. So we're going to write a comment first, and the comment says, the comment says simplify width and height calculations. Just as this makes sense, because this would be a comment to us. Which would tell us what it was we did just following it. Okay, good. So we put that comment in there. Nice use for a comment. And now we're going to do an HTML. So it's going to say everything, and we're really going to type the code in here. Curly brackets, put an enter there, and we're going to say box sizing. I can choose, it's giving me these choices. I can use them, border box, but do notice it doesn't give me the semicolon, which I've always found a little bit annoying. It wants to save me from all kinds of mistakes, except for perhaps the most common one there. So we're using the border box method for sizing. And then on the next line, we're going to create something else, which you can read more about and find out more about, but this just says everything and everything before and everything after. This is probably unnecessary, but it's kind of like a universal code. Box sizing is going to inherit throughout. And it's going to actually use a pseudo class. And this is right if you go to page 26, you can just type it directly from there. Colon before, comma, asterisk, everything, in other words. Everything before, everything after. All right, and we're going to do curly brackets. All right, and inside the curly brackets, by the way, don't be concerned that your asterisks and asterisks before and so on don't have nice colors or something, because it's this is not very common CSS stuff. It's not completely recognizing this, but it will work fine. Box sizing. So we'll go box sizing again, and we're going to tell it to inherit. And there it is, inherit. And then we put the semicolon afterwards. And if it bothers me, I can get rid of that blank line. And if it bothers me, I can get rid of that blank line there too. So we did a little bit of code. Meaning of the style rule is rather advanced. You can read about that paragraph on page 26. Please do read through that section. We've completed that through 26, and I'm now turning on to the idea of installing an Adobe web font. Okay, so this web font thing is just a little extra. I think we're really doing it because Adobe likes to show off their web font system. It's a free, they have free web fonts that come along with this program, which is actually a really neat thing. And by having the program, I guess you kind of accept that license and you get it for free. So we're going to go ahead with installing the web fonts. It doesn't matter at this point whether we have source code or not, but we might as well go back to source code. And we're going to go to Tools and Manage Fonts. That brings up the Adobe Edge Web Font Manager. We want to find the one called Source. I just start typing it. Not the first one, probably, Source Code Pro. We want Source Sans Pro. Source Sans Pro. So we're going to select it, which adds a check mark, and then we click on Done. By clicking on Done, it should install the web font in our personal configuration, making them available for use in all the sites we create in Dreamweaver. Here's the problem. Sometimes you get an error message when you install this, and I'm not sure if some of you might get an error message. If that happens, don't worry about it, okay? We have an option. We could just use a font stack later when we get to that. When we did this, we'll see that nothing really changed in our code, all right? But our program, boy, look at that. I screwed up that too. B-E-A-C-H. Wow, for the title. And we made changes, so we're going to refresh everything. And in fact, I better save everything too. Save all the related files. Oh, I see. I also have it's kept that old copy of that old responsive around too, which it will lose afterwards, but that's because it's not connected to our thing. So we'll get rid of that file out of the folder later. We can just delete that file. It appears to think it has a file there. Anyway, about web fonts. When we come to do our CSS stylings, we'll do it in a few minutes using the CSS designer. When we come to choose fonts, if that font isn't available, that's Adobe Source Sans Pro, don't worry about it, because we can just choose another font stack. In fact, at that point, I will give you the option for that. So if you got an error message when you did this, it's okay. Don't worry about it. And by the way, that reminds me, make sure, yes, you're saving this, hopefully like on your drive, and you're saving as you go and so on. Please think about backing your drive up regularly. So on your laptop, for instance, or somewhere else, make sure you keep a copy of all that stuff. Keep it backed up in case something happens to it. Okay, next we're going to add, use a CSS designer to add the basic styles to the page, which is on page 28. Okay, here we go with the CSS designer. One thing that's mentioned here is that CSS designer is docked with the snippets, but you'll see in my version of the program anyway, it is not. Though frankly, it could be. I could take these tabs and move them around and stuff. CSS designer is up here, and snippets is down here. Now, we've not really looked at snippets, and I don't plan to be using snippets. It's actually very interesting, a lot of chunks of code. The suggestion and the instructions were that we made that little piece of CSS with the border box, that we would just drag it down into here and add it as another snippet in here, which would be the sort of thing you would do. Dreamweaver, depending on what version you have, may give you a bunch of snippets already, things you could use and reuse, that they think are like, why bother retype it when it's a commonly redone thing. You can certainly look at those and play with them. Might give you some neat ideas. But that's not what we're here for. We'll leave the DOM up for right now. It's all collapsed. What we're here for is the CSS designer. And one thing that's mentioned is, what does your CSS designer look like? Does it look like this in one column? That's not very useful. Instead, we want to make make it a little wider until it snaps into two columns. So please adjust your screen by hovering over the divider between this panel section and this section with code and live view, so we can see the two sections of it. We should see sources, at media, selectors, and then properties over here. And let's go through these and just to describe them as it does in your text. I'm on the bottom of page 28 right now, and we're going through them and looking at them here. So sources, this lists where all the styles in the current page come from, and it should say responsive.css, or whatever the heck you named your document, your CSS document, right? That should be sources. That is the only source. If you had multiple CSS documents linked to your page, more would be listed here. Okay. At media, this lists at media queries, they're called, and this has to do with certain chunks of text which only apply to certain page widths, certain chunks of CSS code, that is. We will be doing something with that in part 7. Selectors, you get the idea what selectors are. We talk about selectors with CSS. This is where all the CSS selectors are in the selected source. So it's responsive is selected, and we see the selectors that are here. HTML and then before and after. Let's just take a look at our responsive. HTML before and after. I guess the hashtag, the IDs are not listed there, so it's not detecting wrapper at this time there. All right, and then there is a search field at the top to help find selectors in a large style sheet. All right, so that's the selectors, and there's this little search thing here. And then the properties would be the things that we're doing to those selectors. Okay, so let's make sure that the all button is selected at the top of the designer. So we have current and all. Okay, all except that's right. And we look at, as opposed to current are the ones that we're using at the moment, or all as all of them are available. And now we see HTML and hashtag wrapper down there in the selectors. All is selected about CSS designer. Select responsive CSS in the source. That's correct. That means we're going to be writing our CSS there. Good. And we don't need that media pane, so we could drag it out of the way a little bit. If we wanted to, we could drag that up, and we could drag this up a little bit too to make a little more space. So we don't have to see the at media right now. We could get a little more space in there for the selectors, which we might need more. All right, and the last one, wrapper, doesn't have any styles yet. If we click on wrapper, there's no properties there right now, right? When you create a new selector, Dreamweaver always inserts it at the bottom of the style sheet unless another selector is already highlighted. It's a good idea to keep your styles in logical order, so select the at before, after, that one right there, right? And deselect the show set checkbox at the top right of the properties pane. So it's not, so now it's offering us all the possible properties for that, for whatever it is we're going to do. Click the plus button at the top left of the selectors pane to create a new selector. So you want to make a new selector. We hit the plus button here, and it's saying, it's putting it right after that one we have selected already. So it's putting it where we want to, just above the hashtag wrapper. We're going to type in the word body. So we're making a body selector. Double click, two enters, not double click, 2 enters will engage it to confirm that change. With the new selector highlighted, as it is now, we can create a style rule that affects everything on the page by setting it for the body. So if you look on page 30, you'll see the little diagram which shows what your CSS designer panel should look like now. And let's go ahead and continue with that. In the layout section at the top, in fact, look, we'll see we have a layout section, we have a text section, border, background, and more. By default, at the beginning, we are in the layout section. There's a visual tool to setting the margins. That's what this is here. You see it says margin there, and it kind of like shows us the margins all the way around the thing, right? rather than use this on this occasion, click Set Shorthand margin, in other words, and just type 0. In other words, no margins, and we're going to hit Enter to make it take effect. And we can see a rule has been made, body has been added as a selector, and margin is now listed with 0 as the choice. And we didn't have to make sure to put in the colons and the semicolons and so on and so forth, and everything is spelled correctly. So that was the illustration, and we saw a little 0 showed up around all the way around the margin too. Okay, good. Now we're going to click on the text choice here, and we're going to the properties pane. The first property lists color, sets the color of the text. So this is the color of the text. Click on the undefined block, which is right here. There is a color picker. We could pick and like select a color from like a kind of a normal Adobe grouping, but we actually know the color, which is not that unusual. We already ahead of time have a color scheme worked out or something, right? And we're going to do hashtag 4B, 4B, 4B. This is on page, this is a number 13, step number 13 on page 30. So it's hashtag for a hex color 4B, 4B, 4B. And again, enter for the color. All right. And by the way, we are seeing some of these changes happen to some degree as we're moving along here. You should notice the content in the live view move up slightly and to the left as the default. I believe, if I recall correctly, I had suggested you just be in the live view at this time to see the effect, I suppose, of the CSS as we're doing it. So there was a slight change in the page when we did that, and you can take my word for it or not, whatever. This color is a dark gray. So we set the color of the text first. It's a dark gray, which is easier on the eyes than pure black. So the color of the text has gotten just slightly lighter than it was before. Click to the right of font family to open up a menu of commonly used font stacks. So here we are. Oops, we better get back to our body, and we're in text font family. Click to the right of it, and here's all these commonly used font stacks. So here's where we also will see the Source Sans Pro, right? If our Adobe Web, Edge, Web, Edge, whatever fonts they call them, worked properly. But if that did not apply, that's no big deal. What we're going to use right here is, if you have that, go ahead and use Source Sans Pro just by clicking on it. But if that font is not available because you had an error or something, right, you could just use the font stack that begins with Lucinda Grand, which is a nice sans serif stack, a very nice stack you could use right there. Interesting other stacks you could probably crib from and think about using in your resume. But if you have this, click on Source Sans Pro, and all of a sudden lots of things changed on our screen as the fonts are now set for the entire page in this sans serif font. So again, font stacks lists the commonly available fonts in order preference. The first one isn't available, so on and so forth. You know how font stacks work, or you should at this point anyway. In addition to making that change in the CSS, there's also now a new file, a new link here to another file, which is the JavaScript file, which is carrying that font with it, which would be in our JS folder, I believe. So we've got that link going on there too. Let's see, the new file, read-only source, dynamic, so on and so forth. So please read through that bottom of page 30 onto page 31. The value for the font style normal is okay, but the value for the font weight 200 is the equivalent of extra light. And it does look extra light, doesn't it? All right. So we're going to go to the font weight, and instead of 200, which is set at, we want to make it 400. Now, we haven't done much use of, we just, for font weight, just use bold or didn't use it at all because unbold was normal, regular. But there are ways to choose. Some fonts carry with them the option of having much more different levels of boldness. In fact, you saw all the numbers there listed, right? So this is a 400, which is equivalent of roughly normal, right? The font weight problem can be set using a number ranging from 100 to 900, especially because this is one of those Adobe Edge web fonts. It has all those numerical values with it, which is very nice to have all those choices, right? So click alongside font size, and we're going to select EMs as the choice for font size. So we are again in my body and in font size now. Click into this choice, and we're going to click on EMs. And what happened? Everything disappeared. Well, actually, let's get back there again. EMs. The problem is we set the EMs, but we don't have a number attached to it. Okay. Don't panic. The value is 0, but we're going to put in a different value. We're simply going to type 1 in here. Then I hit enter for it to apply. So we're back to 1 EM. For the body specifies that we use like the normal size of the type for the body copy, and then it's increasing, of course, for the different headings. So it starts at sort of like 16 pixels is what normal would be, as it explains on. Now on page 32, and we're moving on to step 22. We're going to start now the background icon of the properties pane. So let's click on background, which is this one right here. So we're in body background. This time we use the color picker, and to pick a color which is a very light blue. So we're going to use the color picker in the background by clicking on the set background color here. And I'm going to turn it to blue, more like a real blue, which is kind of around there, but I want it to be a very light blue. That is a bit more of a purpley blue. That's more of a real blue, I think, right there. And that's more of a light blue right there. You pick what you want. I'm actually looking for kind of like the blue that I see in the menu here. But you want to find a light blue here. Make sure it's set to hex, and it is set to hex, so that's okay. And now we have chose it, and we're going to just click off. And that applies. So now the body has an overall background of this very light blue. Now select the Show Set checkbox to the right of the Properties pane to see all the CSS properties that have been set for the body. So in other words, Show Set shows us the set of things which we have applied. In body selected, Show Set. It shows us that we did margin and then what we did for text. So if you ever want to look back and see what did I do to a certain selector, you can do it by doing the Show Set. Now we're going to set some properties directly in the CSS Designer. Select common properties from various sections in the CSS Designer, a great way to learn CSS. But let's say you're already familiar with CSS and just want to get on with setting properties and values. You can do that in the More section at the bottom of the Properties pane. Dreamweaver speeds up the process with the help of code hints. So let's try it. Even if you're a complete beginner, you should be able to follow these instructions as they're explained here. But you're not a complete beginner because you've been through other stuff before to some degree. Okay, make sure the All button is, again, it's still all sources, right? All here, and responsive is still responsive. Okay, good. And let me just take a look. Let's look back. There's nothing wrong with looking at our code view once in a while to make sure that everything's looking fine. Looks okay. Our link is there, and this is actually the link to the script for the fonts is in the head area also. If we look at the responsive, we see the body is shaping up. All the code has just been built there that we just created here, right? So back to source. I'm going to go back to live. I've got all, and if it doesn't stay on responsive, that's okay. There's only really one place for it to go. It's responsive. I will select that again, and now we wanted to do the Show Set. It's actually still checked there. Okay, good. In the selectors panes, let's select the wrapper. So we've got nothing applied to the wrapper yet. In other words, right? We already created it, so you should see it there. As explained, we're on page 33, moving on to step 3. Because no style has been set for the selector, the properties pane displays only more and 2 editable fields to add a property and a value. So because we have the show set, but nothing has been set here yet, right? So we have the more and we have a property and value. So this is a place where you can just start typing things in. But it's a little easier than just typing. We could type directly into the CSS file, right? It's a little easier than that because it will give us some help as we go. So click inside add property in the field and start typing. As you do so, code hints will apply, so on and so forth. And hit enter or tab to select it. The focus moves to the second field and so on. So we're going to first type in width. Oops, I got all caps here. I'm not sure why I have that. So width, I can just select it. And then it brings us over here. And we want to do then we're going to move to type 100% and press enter return. So 100%. Press enter. Makes the wrapper the full width of the screen. To prevent the wrapper from getting too wide on large screens, add another property, max width, and set it to 1,000 pixels. So we're going to say max. If I start to type with the M, it should give me a X max width, and we're going to put in there 1,000 pixels, which isn't that big really. Remember, there's no space between the number and the unit. Hit enter. So now we have a max width of 1,000 pixels. We're going to center the wrapper by adding a margin property. Margin is going to be 0 and auto. Okay, so we will do margin. And then we're going to do 0 space auto. Hit enter. So we've gotten that centering going on with the size thing, right? 0 and auto. Shorthand for no margin, top and bottom, automatic and left and right. As long as the document window is wider than 1,000 pixels, the page content springs to the center of the live view. Add a background color and set its value to white. So we have a background color on the whole body, but now we're going to do a background color of white. So we could use the code #FFF. And, you know, I should be consistent and make that capital FFF. It would work the same either way. But so we got a little white background there. All right. So we should probably, I think I got all that stuff in here. I did just check to be sure. We did width and 100%. We did max width 1,000 pixels. We centered it with a margin of 0 and auto, and then we had the background color of white, which is #FFF, and save your work. Yeah, okay. So we should save file, save all related files, everything gets saved, and we'll continue along. Text on page 34. Text content is now centered against a white background. Yes. The document window is wider and so on. Yes, you can read that section at the top of page 34. Pixels and high density displays. All right. So this talks about pixels and how pixels work. It's really useful, and you could learn a lot more about pixels and resolution, how it really works on web pages, and how the fact that if you have a high density display, it makes accommodations for it, so it doesn't screw you all up. So the site is starting to look a little bit better. In fact, if we look at it, we just our save, right? So if we go back to our files and choose our index and do a right click and choose open browser, this is what your file should look like so far. So it's starting to come along a little bit, but a lot of work still to do. We'll be next moving on to part 5. Part 5 on page 35 will come in the next video.